Welcome to Solutions OP Clinical Trials Podcast. My name is Olga and I'm the Managing Director of Solutions OP. We are a small team of experienced professionals working on clinical trials in the United Kingdom. I'll use our podcast to discuss hot topics in clinical trials and provide analysis of the latest trends and challenges in pharma and medical device industries, not just in the UK but globally. Thank you for listening. Welcome to this episode of the podcast. In this episode, I'll be providing you a bit of an overview and analysis of the recent Regulatory Intelligence Conference, which happened on 3rd and 4th of November 2025 in London. The event was organised by TOPRA and RAPS. These are the two big regulatory affairs organisations that I'm sure those of you who work in the industry are familiar with. And it was the first regulatory intelligence conference in Europe. So they had in the past one, which was in the US, but they're organizing for the first time this event in Europe. And I'm really happy I managed to attend. And I really hope that we have a second one next year. So the speakers were from big and medium pharma companies, but there were also some representatives from the medical device field. And of course, we had some representatives from the regulators like the UK MHRA, the European Medicine Agency, and also the Swiss Agency for Therapeutic Products, also known as Swissmedic. So in addition, we had quite a few speakers from different vendors who develop artificial intelligence products that are used in regulatory intelligence. Now, personally, I was really pleased that it was less presentations and more panel discussions and more exchange of ideas and experience. We've all been to these conferences where it's just death by PowerPoint presentations, but I'm really pleased to say this was not the case. It was a lot more interactive. We were given a lot of opportunities to ask questions and really to speak to people. So it was a brilliant networking event. So if you are looking to, in the future, to speak to other colleagues and exchange ideas, I think that kind of conference is something that's really beneficial for networking. So the conference was over 2 days. So during the first day, there were different discussions, starting with the role of the regulatory intelligence and the scope of work. The panelists talked about how in big corporations there is an overlap between departments and functions, and this sometimes increase the risk of non-compliance because it's not very clear who's responsible for which part. And it was also mentioned that regulatory affairs and the compliance teams sometimes are merged depending on the company structure. So there were a lot of there were discussion about that one as well. If some people were in favor of having some kind of combined function, while others thought that's not really appropriate, and it makes it more difficult. Personally, to me, I think if you have a good teamwork and you have a good collaboration between the teams, even if you have to separate departments, it should work generally. But that's my my opinion. I know it's different for each company. So the next session was on establishing regulatory intelligence function within the company and why the role is needed. One of the most remarkable statistics was that for 1 year globally, there are 2,304 regulatory news, 912 guidance, and 168 regulations. I think that's enough to explain why we need regulatory intelligence. And if anyone's in doubt, I think that kind of really that statistics put really the background for that explanation if you need to provide information to your senior management. There was a session on measuring success in regulatory intelligence. I think it's a common issue, especially in big corporations where people are not clear of the value of the different departments. And this is particularly the case with regulatory intelligence, where while the team provides intel, they're not necessarily responsible for the implementation of this information and feedback. Now that's a common issue for big corporations. It's and basically in all fields. In small companies, because I work predominantly in small companies and startups, when you have a team of 5 people, you're kind of very clear who's doing what exactly, and many people wear several hats, and you can immediately feel if one person is away for a couple of days. You just see how the workload increase for the rest of the team. So I think from a small company's point of view, we've never had that concern what people are doing and if they're doing the right thing. But for big corporations where you have multiple departments and overlapping functions, I can see how this could be really challenging. So there were different key performance indicators that were discussed during the conference. I think that's something that companies need to set for themselves if they want to measure the work done by their regulatory intelligence team. Now, the following session was about collaboration between the different teams and how to make success of teamwork. Again, I think having these meetings where you bring everyone on the table who is relevant for the task is really good. And of course, businesses always have different priorities. This is something that we understand. Sometimes for them, sales is more important or manufacturing is more important. So it is seen sometimes like when you provide information about regulatory changes, if it's not something imminent that's happening like now, senior management tends to push it away and say, okay, so that's not urgent issue, so we can deal with it whatever we can, later on at some point. So that's something that we see, and it's normal. At the end of the day, all businesses have their priorities. So it's very important that the regulatory intelligence team communicate properly to their stakeholders and make sure that these people understand the implications of not implementing something, the future changes that they need to do and so on, and really put some clear timelines for people in the CM management. It's always very complicated because in our field we see that we have regulations which are with specific timelines, but eventually these regulatory timelines, they change. And you might have something planned for 2026, but all of a sudden, they push it back for 2027. So from business point of view, I can see how senior management is reluctant to invest in something when they don't have a clear scope when this thing's going to start. And obviously, we tend to blame them that they wait until the very end to implement things. But having that uncertainty when something will be implemented, that's definitely a contributor to this delay. And even, for example, with Europe, with the medical device regulation, there's still a lot of uncertainties about things. So people still thinking, should I do that or should I just wait and see what happens? And all that could be avoided if there are a little bit clear timelines and people really try to stick to these timelines, and then it will be a lot easier for the regulatory intelligence team to communicate these regulatory timelines when you have a bit more certainty of when things happen. So that's, I think, was very important feedback and something to think about. So the second day of the conference was dedicated to artificial intelligence in digital tools, which could be used to gather regulatory intelligence on a global scale. So there were discussions on how AI could be used to create a repository of data and also help with real-time monitoring of regulatory changes. Now that's a very interesting a field, because one of the panel discussions that we had was about global regulatory environment. So we in Europe and in the US, Canada, Australia, we have quite a good database where we can find information. Even Japan, there's a good database, but there are many countries, particularly in developing countries, where it's not really clear what their regulations are, what their expectations are. Sometimes they're not available online, sometimes they're not available in English, and sometimes they're missing altogether. So we might have a regulation for something and guidance for something in Europe, which doesn't necessarily mean that people in, let's say, Ethiopia is going to have the same, or any other country around the world is going to have the same guidance. So it could be quite different and challenging. So trying to create a global approach in dealing with regulatory changes around the world where the product is placed on the market could be really challenging if you don't have access to that information. So we all hope that maybe in the future there'll be a little bit more clarity, and it'll be a little bit easier to get that information online so people can plan things in advance. There was also a discussion about AI use in manufacturing. So apparently there are some AI products which are used in low risk manufacturing processes, just to help streamline the process, which is obviously a good thing if that could help with the manufacturing. So we will see how that will develop. I think manufacturing in general is a lot more riskier, and you need to have a really reliable product to be able to do that. So we'll see how it will develop in manufacturing field. One of the biggest topics when it comes to artificial intelligence was the need of human involvement in reviewing summaries generated by AI, and how much we can rely on it. So the younger generation of regulatory affairs professionals were more likely to rely on AI more and to use it more, while the older generation was a lot more cautious. So while the benefits of AI are undeniable, the panelists were aware of the limitations like hallucinations and not always having a real life data. So that it's a complex case. I think we can definitely rely on AI to support us in some cases, but we also need to have the expertise, and we need to have the people who are able to check if the information is correct. As I like to joke, what you're gonna do if you don't have electricity? If you have to make a decision and all of a sudden your electricity is off, does that mean you can't make a decision because you don't know anything about it? We can't afford to rely 100% on technology. At the same time, I'm completely aware that we can't rely 100% on our brain as well, because we have limitations. We can't process that kind of amount of information. So I think we need to find some healthy middle ground where we use technology, but at the same time we maintain our ability to review and analyze data. A very interesting part of the second day was the presentation from the UK MHRA, European Medicine Agency, and Swiss Agency for Therapeutic Products, Swiss Medic, in terms of the initiative called Horizon Scanning, which involves gathering data to help them predict what regulatory changes are needed in the future and what they can expect in the future. So while there is a demand for more open access data for the from the regulators. I think we all have to acknowledge that there is a lot of confidential information and patent protection. So from a legal point of view, it's a lot more complicated, and that definitely limits how much data could be reviewed and shared, not only with the general public but also between regulators, because they need to consider all these laws and protections which are offered to the companies. But what they're doing is basically, it was a clear signal that they're also using AI technologies to get information, and they're doing their own internal analysis, and obviously for many things they are sharing information and discussing things between themselves. As always, it was mentioned, we always hope for some kind of harmonization, so more or less everyone's doing the same thing rather than each country coming up with their own ideas of how things should be done. I think everyone in the industry is really keen to see that, and I don't know, I'm optimistic one day might happen. You never know. So I'm really hoping that might change. So now the last bit I wanted to discuss is the impact of regulatory intelligence and what it means for startups and small businesses, because as I mentioned, I work with startups and small businesses. So I think my personal view is the vast majority of the available AI tools are unaffordable for the budget of the startups. Another thing is the startups are definitely in disadvantage considering the big number of new regulations and the guidance and the challenges of accessing them. I think one good example was given with the website of European Medicine Agency, that there's special companies who are working on extracting data from this website so that they can share it with the company, so that there are vendors who provide that service. So you can imagine the vast amount of information on this website and how it's structured and so on. So finding that information is really hard. So I think definitely startups would benefit to have some tools to help them, because managing all that by themselves, it's a hard job, it's a hard work, and it's a difficult job, particularly when the resources are limited in startups. So that's just another layer of the many responsibilities of the team. You know, they're not just in manufacturing things, they're not just thinking about compliance, but they need to think about obtaining the regulatory data that they need for their product and so on. So that's really complicated. Now, if you think from the point of view of the statistics that I mentioned, even if they don't need all that information, even a small fraction from it, you know, you have a small team of 5 to 10 people, and they all have to deal with this and process that information and find what is relevant and so on. So it is a massive work for the startups to monitor the regulatory regulations and compliance. And also there's a limited amount of experienced regulatory affairs professionals who work with startups, which is a result of non-compliance, because very often you have someone who might have a slight idea of regulatory affairs, might have worked on something in the past. You know, you don't necessarily have the best people working for startups, because startups have small budgets, so they can't even afford to hire the best people, even if they want to. And offering them expensive, sometimes these regulatory affairs professionals offer them quite expensive solutions, because they come from corporate world where, that costs £30,000. Oh, that's fine, we can do that. But the startup can't afford this budget. So it's really complicated. I think we need definitely more people who are from regulatory affairs who work with startups and have that level of experience. Another thing is that startups don't have realistic information on competitors. and any tricks that could give them an advantage when they're preparing for submission to the authorities. So, for example, from people presenting on that conference and discussions, you can see that some companies, they have a whole team which is just getting that type of regulatory intelligence of competitors, how products were approved on the market, what tricks were used, and so on. So all that information is not accessible for small businesses and for the startups. So another thing is that it was made very clear during the discussions is sometimes they even have, in some big corporations, teams that work on policy. So they're working together with the regulators, government, to have an impact on the policy and how this field, research field and disease field, is represented and explored and so on. So they even have, someone who works on these consultations, public consultations, and these policies with the regulators. So this is a really big impact that the big companies can have, which the small companies, they can't even dream of having it. So that's the biggest challenges. But I think there are some positive things that I want to touch on, and I think there is still a lot that could be done for anyone who is interested to support small businesses and startups. For example, the regulators could create a simple repository that contains all the information on a specific topic. For example, laws, regulations, guidance, everything in one place. For example, you want to develop implantable medical devices. Okay, so there's a website. I have all the links here with all the information that you want for implantable medical devices. This will really help the startups, because at least they'll have everything in one place. Yes, it's still vast amount of information they need to process and read through and so on, but at least they'll have everything in one place, so they don't need to go and search for it and wonder if they've missed something. So that will be something that could really be helpful. The other thing is reduce the duplication and unnecessary complexity of existing regulations. All these nice to have things, they should go, and just leave what is really relevant for patient safety and efficacy. Because I think in the desire of the regulators to help companies, sometimes they produce these very detailed guidelines, or they provide some very detailed scientific advice to someone, information then which is available online. And then everyone else feels they have to do it the exact same way because this is what the agency expects from them. So I think this is the biggest problem that regulators need to understand. When you're providing some public information and some guidance and so on, that sets the expectations for everyone, that they need to kind of comply to this one, even if it's just recommendation. For many people in the industry, it feels like, oh, I need to do it that way, otherwise it's not going to be accepted. So I think the regulators really need to think what kind of guidances they put, and really to encourage companies to go and reach out to the regulators when they have particular questions, and not just to follow the most detailed path that's being given to them. So I think that will be a very important message to send to startups and small businesses. And the last thing I would like to mention is to create a helpline for startups and small businesses, which is not complex as a scientific advice. For scientific advice, you have to prepare months in advance to submit these questions and so on, and have data and so on. But really, something that people can use to have just to check something with the regulator, something that they're not sure about. Now, obviously, we can always risk by creating that kind of service that someone's going to ask something very silly that you have it already in the guidance, and you can just send them a link and say, well, you can read it, it's over there here. It's over there. Now, of course, there's always risk with this one, which is why you can have a helpline with different levels. The level 1 support, if someone comes up with something like that, you can just send them the link and say, well, it's written here, read it. But if there's something more complex, then you can have a level to support someone to really look into it. And I think that's very much what the regulatory agencies are doing. However, still the preferences in terms of particularly dealing with clinical data and so on, that companies go through formal scientific advice. But I really wish we had this informal scientific advice for those who don't have the resources to prepare for scientific advice, who sometimes don't have the funding to prepare for such meetings, and they very often don't have the time even to do that because they're very small teams. So we always try to think big. I think in this particular case, it would be great if we can think small. So that's my analysis, and that's what I think will be really beneficial for the small companies. And as I like to say, all big corporations were startups at the beginning. We need to allow startups to develop their products and bring more innovation to patients, because at the end of the day, this is what we are working to achieve. We want to have better treatment options for our patients. Thank you for listening.